I've taken this video so many times, guys. I'm gonna try this again. All right, I'm going to attempt to do something that I have never done before. And the reason why I haven't done it is because it is so incredibly complex and hard to answer. But it's probably the number one question and inquiry that I get since I have been on any social media app. Bear with me, I'm going to try my absolute best. Like I said, I've taken this video like 17 times and try to answer it for everybody, okay? So what I'm referring to is the question of all questions for Native people, and that is, how does one identify with Indigenous identity? How do I reconnect to an Indigenous ancestry or heritage that I have? And can I claim my Indigenous ancestors? And so I'm gonna try my absolute best to answer this question. And I wanna premise this video by saying, first and foremost, these are just my opinions. There's a lot of room for interpretation here. People have very hard opinions about this. It's potentially a very dangerous question to try to answer, which is why a lot of people don't answer it either. But I think it's really important, and I want to be able to give you guys the most honest answer that I possibly can. I think I'm finally at a point where I can at least attempt to do this. And so I want to start off this video by saying, again, I'm going to try my best. Just bear with me for a little bit. We're gonna get there, I promise, but it's very complex. It's a very hard question to answer. So starting off, verbiage and words matter here. And I'm going to go through these certain terminologies and titles to help you understand where you're at in your journey, whether to reconnect into an Indigenous heritage, lineage, or reaffirm your identity, okay? So there's basically a few terms I want to go over for identifying markers, and that is tribal status, lineage, and ancestry. These three things I think are super, super important, and I think people get them very confused. And it can be very easy, if you don't understand, to misrepresent yourself and misrepresent where you're at on your journey. So we're gonna start with the first one, which is tribal status. For a lot of people, their indigeneity or their Indigenous status is based off of their tribal status, which is, are you an enrolled member of a tribe or not? First off, there are over 570 federally recognized tribal nations in the United States. But that's just federally recognized tribes. That does not include things such as unrecognized tribes, and that does not include state recognized tribes. Someone's tribal federal status does not always play a part in indigeneity. There has been a lot of history here in the United States that include different eras of time. Those eras include things such as the Relocation Era, in which tribes were forcefully removed from their traditional homelands into other parts of the country, therefore sometimes losing or splitting their tribal nation. This happened with the Cherokee and coming from southeastern United States and moving into Oklahoma, for instance. And because of their relocation, some of them only got recognized by the state, whereas others got recognized by the entire federal government. So it can be very complex. Then you have unrecognized tribes, which are tribes that have culture and have actual blood members of their tribe, but because of a time in history where they're trying to eradicate and disenfranchise tribes so that they don't get tribal recognition, they just got completely disbanded or signed as an LLC or an enterprise rather than a sovereign nation. This happened to a lot of tribes in California, where the Extermination Era wiped out like 70% of their nations in that state, though a lot of them still remain today. So, not always huge, it's not always something you can stand on, that's what I'm saying. But for the sake of this video, enrollment usually happens one of two ways. Usually. I understand that there are some tribes that actually have other factors, such as maternal and paternal relationship, and that can dictate someone's status in their tribe, or their enrollment status in the tribe. And for the sake of this video, we're not gonna get into that, but there's two, normally. Some tribes enroll off of blood quantum, which means that you carry a certain degree of Indigenous blood, you have enrollment in that tribe. And it's broken down the way that you would think. If your father is a full-blooded tribal member and your mother is a non-member, then yeah, it would make you half. And usually this blood quantum typically cuts off at the 25% mark. And for a lot of people, they consider blood quantum as a colonial construct. And that bears a lot of truth. Again, there's a lot of history behind that, but for the sake of the video, basically it was a tool that was used by the US government in order to strip people from their indigenous identity over time. And also develop a sense of disbelonging with people who have lower blood quantum. They'd be more likely to leave tribal communities and therefore assimilate into white culture. And like I said, there's a lot of truth behind this. However, I also want to acknowledge that's not always the case. There are some certain tribes whose clanship systems match up perfectly with the whole blood quantum standard, receiving 2 clans from your father, 2 clans from your mother. And if you break it down mathematically, if they marry non-tribal members and have kids with non-tribal members, they lose half their clans. And once you lose your clanship, you lose traditional cultural identity, and it just so happens to coincide perfectly with a blood quantum standard. A common misconception is that it applies to everybody, and it doesn't. But it does for most, and I will admit that. The other thing that you have are tribes that have lineage. And lineage does not work off the blood quantum. You don't have to meet a certain degree of Indian blood in order to be enrolled in the tribe, but rather you have to be able to tie a direct line between you and a documented native ancestor that was put on a census roll. A famous tribe that works off of lineage is the Cherokee people, which they require their members to prove through paperwork their relation to ancestors on the Dawes rolls. And if you can do that, regardless of your blood quantum, you can have enrollment status in the tribe. And those are typically the 2 ways someone enrolls in a tribal nation. And for some people, they accept that having tribal enrollment is enough to identify yourself as an indigenous person. Then you can say, yes, I'm an enrolled member of this tribe. But it gets more confusing, and I'll explain why here in a second. So the last term I want to go over is ancestry. Now, people use lineage and ancestry interchangeably when they really shouldn't, because there is a difference, and I'm going to explain that. The difference between somebody who has lineage, they can tie themselves directly to somebody who is a documented member on a census roll. Whereas somebody who has ancestry cannot prove that, but can say, especially with the rise of things like 23andMe and Ancestry.com, can say, I do have indigenous blood, but I can't tie it to any ancestor. I can't tie it to a Dawes roll. I can't tie it to anything like that. So you have indigenous ancestors, sure, but you have no idea where it goes from there. You typically can't tie it to a tribe. You can't tie it to a culture or anything like that. You have indigenous ancestry. Congratulations, but it ends there. So if that's you, then you can tell people, hey, yeah, I have indigenous ancestry, but I am not an enrolled member, and I'm not somebody who has indigenous lineage. And then it ends there, okay? So that's ancestry. It's pretty cut and dry. But going back to the other 2, which is enrollment and which is lineage, there are subterms that go along with these, or subtitles. And that is connected, disconnected, or reconnecting. Now, when I said earlier in the video that I'm going to come back to this, when I said it's not always what constitutes somebody's indigenous identity, this is what I mean by that. So first off, somebody who is connected. Somebody who is a connected individual means they have the lived experience of practicing their culture accurately. This also means that they have an understanding of their tribal history, the exposure to or can speak fluently in their indigenous language. It also means that they are politically aware and can understand and accurately portray their tribe's perspectives, culturally speaking. A disconnected individual is somebody who doesn't have cultural understanding. These people didn't grow up practicing the culture. They don't speak their language. They don't live in tribal communities. They have no political understanding, and they can't portray their culture accurately. 70% of Native people don't live in tribal communities. Most Native people are disconnected. They, because of history and because of relocation and extermination, assimilation, genocide, whatever, they didn't grow up with those things, and that's not necessarily their fault. And it doesn't make them any less Native. All it means is that we understand that this person is disconnected. This tells you how accurately they can portray their culture and their opinions on behalf of their culture. The last one is probably the most complex, and that is reconnecting. A reconnecting native is somebody who has been at one point completely disconnected from their culture or was never fully connected. And there are people who are learning their language. Maybe they grew up in tribal community, but didn't practice their culture all the way, whether it be spiritually or socially. But they are in the process of regaining. They're in the process of rediscovering what that is, and they're on their journey to becoming a connected person. And I think in the beginning of anyone's journey to understanding their relation to indigeneity, you have to understand these titles and like these subtitles. And just go over them again. That is your tribal status, like are you enrolled or not enrolled, while also understanding that there are federally recognized tribes, there are state recognized tribes and unrecognized tribes, and those histories and where they stand in the indigenous community, lineage, and ancestry. Pairing with, are you connected, disconnected, or reconnected? So you can be an enrolled member and connected. I'm a connected, enrolled member of my tribe. Or you can be disconnected. I'm an enrolled, disconnected member of my tribe. And so on and so forth. Same thing with lineage, being connected or being disconnected, or I have ancestry and I'm connected or disconnected. Though you typically won't use those subterms with just ancestry, but I don't know, maybe. So how you represent yourself and what you tell people matters because it tells them where they're at and how knowledgeable you are. And it's okay to be anywhere on the spectrum. Like there's nothing wrong with any one of these. It's just a matter of understanding so that you don't come off as somebody who is misrepresenting themselves, disrespecting the culture, or disrespecting an individual. And I think for anyone who is reconnecting to their culture or wants to get involved or is curious, understanding your terminology is going to get you very far, and it's shown that you've done your homework and that you've listened and that you've been actively learning. And that's really only going to benefit you in the long run. Now, with that said, I also want to acknowledge one last thing, and this is probably the most important thing, and that is every tribe's understanding of belonging looks different. These are independent sovereign nations. We were independent sovereign nations before colonization. We are independent sovereign nations now, and we will be independent sovereign nations tomorrow. These tribes have their own protocols to being able to lay claim to their tribal identity. And those may look different from one neighboring tribe to another. So you can't really cast a net on what that looks like. For some cultures, being an enrolled member is simply, that's enough. You can claim that. And for some cultures and some tribes, that's not enough. In order for you to represent and call yourself a member of our tribe, you need community acceptance. You need to go through coming of age ceremonies. You need to do this, you need to do that. It can be vastly different. So the first thing I would suggest to somebody who is on their reconnection journey or is curious about a reconnection journey would be to understand your terminology, find the independent nation that you come from, and start asking questions and showing up and learning and walking with the understanding that may look very different to what you may expect or what you've seen other people go through as well. So I hope that answers your question. That was a rough one. So I really can't give you any more than that. So good luck to each and every one of you. Blessings on your journey wherever you're at and wherever you're headed next. And I hope this helps. See y'all later.